taking a look at this excerpt from Jeremy Bentham. The purpose of this part of the course is to look at two moral theories, which I think are good to look at in concert because they sort of play off each other and are great contrasts. Utilitarianism on the one hand, of course, Bentham is a utilitarian, and Kantianism, moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant. They are very opposed in most ways, at least on the surface. And the title of this excerpt from Bentham's work is definitely the editor's title. Bentham never wrote anything called classical hedonism, but it does help in the sense that, yes, Bentham is a hedonist, and so is Mill in a qualified way, but they are hedonists. Hedonism comes from the Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. And I think that is something to keep in mind. That is, if we ask ourselves, what is the good? What is that which is the good? That question that we're left with after Thomas Aquinas says that the good should be pursued and evil avoided, we are left with the question of what is good and evil, and this is a certain answer to that. And the answer is the good is pleasure and evil is pain. That is not to be taken in any kind of specific sense of physical pleasure and physical pain. Every utilitarian that I know of really has a more expansive view. For instance, here, really the view of utility. This is actually quite helpful, this little paragraph here on the first page. By utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. So all of those things, as he says, all this in the present case comes to the same thing: benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness is what he means by utility. And the opposite would be, as he says, or what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness. So we get a very broad, sort of expansive idea of what he considers to be the good: anything that is to human benefit, anything that causes happiness, anything that improves human welfare, anything that promotes those things is good. And the opposite, he says, mischief, pain, evil, unhappiness, anything that damages the welfare of a human being is considered evil or bad. That is hedonism, I suppose, is that the good is pleasure, widely construed. Evil is pain, widely construed. The good is happiness. Evil is unhappiness. The good is welfare. Evil is suffering. And Bentham probably feels that he's just pointing out the obvious, and maybe he is. His opening statement here is quite striking, where he says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, two forces which control everything that we do. He says, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. That's an important distinction, because, of course, the first one is an ethical matter, what we ought to do. The second one, what we shall do, is simply a psychological, you could say, matter. We will, in a psychological sense, always pursue pleasure. We will always avoid pain. To make it into an ethical theory, a moral theory, is an additional step to say that not only will we do these things, we ought to do these things. We have a duty, you might say, to increase pleasure in the world, to increase happiness in the world, to decrease pain, to prevent as much as possible human pain, suffering, and unhappiness. Again, I think that Bentham thought that he was simply pointing out to us what we already knew, and he may be right about that. That is, that this is, this is so built in to our way of looking at the world and our way of ordering our actions that it probably will be obvious, the principle of utility. And that is important to note, what he calls the principle of utility down here on the bottom of the page. The principle of utility is the foundation of the present work. It will be proper, therefore, at the outset to give an explicit and determinate account of what is meant by it. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. That is, we should be consequentialists, right? You should know that term by now. That is, that an action or a possible action is to be evaluated morally in terms of its consequences, and it's specifically its consequences for human happiness. If it augments, if it grows or encourages human happiness, generally speaking, it's good. If it diminishes human happiness in some way, if it prevents human happiness, if it causes unhappiness, it should be discouraged. Again, I think Bentham thought that he was just pointing out the obvious here. And again, maybe he was. So, of course, if that is the outlook, that we are consequentialists, we approve or disapprove of actions in relation to how they impact in their results human happiness, then we have to have a way of calculating, of adding up pleasure and pain. And that's what he suggests in the rest of this excerpt, is really how to do that. I don't know how valuable that is, really, but it is certainly something that would be an immediate practical problem, because that's not so easy to do. That is, if we're trying to anticipate the effects of our actions on pain and pleasure, unhappiness and happiness, then we have to have a way of measuring those things, measuring pain, measuring happiness, pleasure. And he gives us a rough way of doing that in terms of intensity, duration, what he calls certainty or uncertainty, and its propinquity, its nearness or remoteness, its farness. So he gives us a method for calculating pleasures and pains. I don't want to go into it in specific because I don't think it's really that valuable. I don't think it adds much to our way that we estimate these things in an intuitive way. But of course, it is a very important practical problem for utilitarians. How do you actually measure pleasure and pain? Because at the end of the day, as he says here, you sum up all the values of all the pleasures on the one side and those of all the pains on the other, and you look for the balance, and that's what you should do. It's really an algorithm, I suppose, in the way that's presented. Is that you should, he really did think, I suppose, that ethics could become a kind of a quantitative science. You could do it, you could sum up, you could measure pleasures, you could measure pains as a way of doing the right thing. Of course, what's taken for granted here, I suppose, is that it's not an entirely selfish hedonism. It is a social hedonism, you might say. Last step here, take an account of the number of persons whose interests appear to be concerned, and repeat the above process with respect to each. You're not supposed to just do what will make you happy. The idea, of course, is to do what will make everyone the happiest possible in any given situation.